There is a winter almost nobody remembers now, 1363 to 1364. Across parts of Europe, the cold became so severe that the Rhine near Mainz stayed icebound for about 70 days, and in Cologne, people reportedly held a market on the frozen river itself. Imagine that for a second, a marketplace on ice, in the middle of one of the hardest winters medieval Europe could deliver. And yet, even in winters like that, most villages did not simply turn into frozen graveyards. They suffered, they shivered, they buried their dead. But more often than not, they endured. So how? How did communities made of timber, mud, straw, and animal dung survive winters that could lock great rivers in ice? Because the medieval village was not just a cluster of poor huts in a snowy field. It was a survival machine. Not a comfortable one, not a clean one, not a healthy one by modern standards, but a system built around one brutal truth. If you wanted to live through winter, everything had to serve warmth, food, fuel, and cooperation. The house, the barn, the animals, the woods, the family, even the smoke choking the rafters, all of it formed a kind of winter armor. And that is the part modern imagination often gets wrong. We picture medieval villagers as helpless people trapped in flimsy huts. In reality, many of them lived in buildings and communities that had evolved over generations specifically to resist cold. The first reason villages rarely froze is almost embarrassingly simple. Their houses were built to keep heat in, not to impress anyone outside. In Northern Europe, ordinary medieval houses were often timber-framed structures filled with wattle, plaster, or earth, roofed in thatch, floored in earth, and pierced by only a few small windows because glass was expensive. A summary of typical housing places, many of these homes in the range of roughly 450 to 675 square feet, with families crowding into very little space. In the English Midlands, surviving crook houses show a central open hall with a hearth below and a smoke louvre above. And many of these supposedly ordinary peasant houses date from the late 13th to the 16th century. Small space plus fire plus limited openings meant one thing. Whatever heat you made had less room to escape. That does not mean those homes were pleasant. They were often smoky, dim, crowded, and dangerous. But danger, in this case, tells us something important. The second big clue comes from real coroner's inquests from the 13th and 14th centuries. These records do not describe villagers turning into icicles in their beds. They describe a world of open hearth accidents. Children scalded when pots tipped over, candles setting bedding on fire, even chickens igniting straw on the floor. That is a remarkable detail. It means the medieval peasant house was not defined by the absence of heat. Quite the opposite. It was full of flame, embers, boiling liquid, hot iron, and smoke. The true risk inside was often not freezing, it was getting burned. And that brings us to the hearth, the true heart of the village winter. In medieval houses, the fire was not decorative, it was not occasional, it was the center of cooking, drying, heating, light, and social life. Smoke escaped through the roof opening or louvre, but not all of it escaped quickly. Some remained inside, warming the upper air and blackening the timbers with soot. To modern lungs, this sounds miserable, and it probably was. But from the standpoint of survival, it mattered. Medieval villagers were not trying to create modern, fresh air interiors. They were trying to keep living bodies warm enough to last until spring. In a climate of repeated hard frosts, a smoky house with a live fire was infinitely better than a clean, airy, heat-leaking room. The third reason villages survived is one modern people often find strange. Animals were part of the winter heating system. A widely used summary of pre-industrial housing notes that in many places animals were quartered inside the house or below it, so their body heat could help warm the dwelling. Christopher Dyer's work on peasant livestock adds nuance to that picture. Peasants did not always have elaborate specialist buildings, but in severe weather animals were likely put into barns and other flexible shelters, because barns were multifunctional spaces and peasants adapted them to circumstance. So whether beasts were literally under the same roof, in an attached byre, or stalled in nearby buildings that were constantly entered and worked, livestock were not just wealth on four legs. In winter, they were warmth, manure, milk, traction, and insurance against disaster. This is where the village stops looking like a row of houses and starts looking like a heat economy. A cow was not just a cow. It was a moving reservoir of calories and warmth. Straw was not just bedding, it was insulation. Manure was not just waste, it fertilized the fields that would feed next year's family. A barn was not just storage. In harsh weather, it could become shelter. Even a humble peasant holding was part of a larger cycle in which crops fed animals, animals fed land, land fed people, and people kept the whole machine running through the dead season. Dyer emphasizes that peasants collectively kept enormous numbers of animals and that these animals made a major contribution to rural production. In other words, the village was economically and physically structured around resilience, not comfort. Then there was the human body itself. Medieval winter survival depended on closeness. Families often slept in shared rooms, sometimes effectively in one main sleeping space. Privacy was a luxury, warmth was a necessity. Barbara Hanawalt's work on Peasant Families emphasizes how central the household was as the basic unit of medieval survival, and general housing surveys note that entire families commonly slept together. To a modern viewer, this may sound oppressive. To a medieval villager, it reduced heat loss, shared bedding, shared rooms, shared labor, shared risk. None of that was romantic, but it was effective. The medieval family was a winter technology as much as it was a social unit. The materials mattered too. A modern person sees mud, daub, thatch, and earth and thinks primitive. But those materials do not behave like thin concrete shells. They hold warmth differently. They breathe differently. And above all, they were available locally, repairable locally, and understood locally. Villagers did not need a supply chain to survive winter. They needed timber, straw, clay, dung, labor, and know-how. That meant a damaged wall, roof, or floor could be patched by the same community that lived inside it. Medieval housing was fragile by our standards, yes, but it was also maintainable and in a pre-industrial world that mattered more than elegance. And then there was fuel. Medieval people lived in what historians sometimes call a biomass economy. Wood was a building material, a tool source, and, crucially, fuel. One agricultural history study describes wood as a vitally important raw material and equally important wood fuel in the medieval world. The archaeology of peasant houses also points to rights such as houseboat, which allowed some peasants supervised access to timber from the lord's woods, though often not enough for an entire house. That tells us something else about winter. Surviving it was not just about architecture, but about access to surrounding landscape. A village beside woodland, common rights, scrub, and managed resources had a better chance than a village that lost those links. Winter survival was not sealed inside four walls. It extended out into hedges, coppices, commons, and lordly woods. But none of this means winter was easy. Medieval villages did not freeze solid very often because they were adapted to cold. That is not the same thing as saying they were safe, and when the system failed, it failed horribly. One of the clearest examples is the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Contemporary chroniclers described relentless summer rain, grain that would not ripen, bread that no longer nourished properly, livestock dying, prices soaring, and the poor lying dead in streets and wards. Henry S. Lucas, in his classic study of the famine, collected evidence showing widespread crop failure across much of Europe, from Scotland to Italy, and from the Pyrenees eastward. This is the crucial distinction. Villages usually did not die first because their walls were cold. They died when weather broke the chain of food, fodder, and fuel that made winter survivable at all. Listen to the logic of that famine for a moment. The chronicler does not mainly complain that huts were too cold. He complains that grain would not ripen, that bread was weak, that animals could not be fed, that ordinary food became ruinously expensive. In other words, the medieval village could absorb cold better than it could absorb the collapse of supply. That is why the real enemy of winter was often not temperature alone, but duration. A bad harvest before winter, a wet summer, diseased livestock, or repeated climatic shocks that arrived year after year. A village could survive frost. What it struggled to survive was frost after failure after failure. There is another revealing document, much older, from Gregory of Tours. He describes a winter more severe than usual, with streams frozen so hard they became paths, and birds so weakened by cold and hunger that people could catch them by hand. That is a vivid image of true medieval cold. Not poetic cold, but killing cold. Yet even here, What we see is not the disappearance of village life. We see adaptation around an event so severe it entered the written record. Medieval writers remembered these winters precisely because they were extraordinary. The fact that they recorded them at all is almost proof of the larger point. Villages usually bent under winter, but they did not automatically break. So why did medieval villages rarely freeze during brutal winters? Because a village was never just a few poor houses standing separately in the cold. It was a compact, interdependent system designed around heat concentration, fuel use, animal management, household clustering, and communal knowledge. Houses were small. Fires burned constantly. Smoke stayed where modern builders would never tolerate it. Animals were sheltered as economic assets and sources of warmth. Families slept close. Villagers knew how to repair roofs, patch daub, manage wood, preserve food, and make scarce resources last. By modern standards, it was harsh. By medieval standards, it was survival engineering. And that may be the deepest lesson of all. Medieval villages did not defeat winter by making life comfortable. They defeated it by making life collective. Warmth was shared. Risk was shared. Labor was shared. Even suffering was shared. That is why the medieval village could outlast winters that froze rivers, buried roads, and starved birds out of the sky. Not because people were tougher in some mythical sense, and not because the weather was kinder than we imagine, but because village life itself had been shaped, slowly, painfully, generation after generation, into a form that could endure the cold. And maybe that is why the image stays with us. Outside, a white world of frost and hunger. Inside, a low dark room thick with smoke, animals shifting somewhere nearby, a pot hanging over the fire, children half asleep under rough blankets, and a family gathered close around the one thing standing between them and the night. Not luxury, not safety, but enough heat, enough food, and enough people beside you to make it to morning.